President Eisenhower was one of the most influential presidents in recent memory. Today, we're going to speak to some experts on what made his presidency and what specific roles he filled out during his time in office.
The climax of the Republican convention in San Francisco is reached with the arrival of President and Mrs. Eisenhower.
Dr. Ludwig, as opposed to other presidents, what was President Eisenhower's role in the Republican Party?
Eisenhower is not the conventional strong party leader in the sense that both parties pursued him, and he did not actually identify strongly with either of the party's ideals. In the 1948 election, Truman had even offered to run as Eisenhower's vice president to ensure a Democratic victory. But rather than exemplify the Republican Party in the 1952 and 1956 elections, Eisenhower adopted the platform after being pursued as a candidate. In fact, Eisenhower had never actually voted in an election. In the 1950s, party leaders chose state delegates for nominating conventions, although political parties are never mentioned in the Constitution. In the 1952 election, with a popular presidential candidate, the party itself often takes control of the House and the Senate. Eisenhower won a big victory with 55% of the popular vote and a landslide in the Electoral College with 442 votes to Stevenson's 89. He even scored well in the Democratic Solid South. Stevenson faced a much tougher fight for the Democratic nomination than he had 4 years earlier. Stevenson had trouble finding effective issues. On Election Day, Eisenhower won an even more impressive victory than he had 4 years earlier. He carried 41 states and received nearly 58% of the popular vote. He ran better in the South than he had 4 years earlier, even taking Louisiana. This was the first time that state had voted Republican since the end of Reconstruction. Democrats retained control of Congress, which they had secured in the midterm elections of 1954. Eisenhower was the first candidate since Zachary Taylor to win the presidency without having his party gain a majority of seats in either the House or the Senate. This almost indicates that Eisenhower wasn't as much of a party leader as a national leader.
President Eisenhower isn't known for his legislative chops, but how did he impact the legislative branch and how did he control it?
Well, the chief legislator is the term for the president as architect of public policy and one who sets the agenda for Congress. Despite the constitutional provision that all legislative power shall be vested in Congress, the president, as the chief formulator of public policy, plays a major legislative role. Much of the legislation dealt with by Congress is drafted at the initiative of the executive branch. Eisenhower was the first president to serve when both houses were controlled by the opposite party. As head of the political party and as principal executive officer of the U.S. government, is in a position to influence public opinion and thereby the course of legislation in Congress. He used this influence to create the Eisenhower Doctrine, where he asserted that America had the right to aid any country threatened by communist aggression. The president's popularity and the partisan makeup of Congress influence how effective a president can be in getting legislation passed. Eisenhower took interest in the space race and talked to Congress about asking legislation to help the country compete with the rest of the world. President Eisenhower, as the chief legislator, are that he helped to strengthen and establish programs like Social Security, that he launched the interstate highway system in 1956, that he continued the New Deal programs, that he was willing to send federal troops into Little Rock, Arkansas, to ensure that local schools were desegregated. This was a very important step in the civil rights movement. That he passed the National Defense Education Act. He signed an act admitting Hawaii as the 50th state. And finally, he got a lot of legislation passed aimed to help America in the space race.
President Eisenhower was primarily elected because of his experience with foreign policy and the military. How did he carry this into his presidency?
No other president, with maybe the exceptions of George Washington and Ulysses S. Grant, brought more fame, success, and military genius to the office of president as Dwight D. Eisenhower. Into the presidency, his prestige as commanding general of the victorious forces in Europe during World War II, Dwight Eisenhower obtained a truce in Korea and worked continuously during his 2 terms to ease his tensions of the Cold War. While in office, when the Chinese began a buildup in the Kaesong Sanctuary, he threatened to use nuclear forces if an armistice were not concluded. His military reputation in Europe was effective with the Chinese. The National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the SAC, the Strategic Air Command, devised detailed plans for his nuclear war in China. Months after he became president, Eisenhower agreed to an armistice that ended 3 years of fighting in Korea. Only on one other occasion, in Lebanon in 1958, did Eisenhower send troops into action. Eisenhower placed new emphasis on nuclear strength, which was popularly known as a massive retaliation to prevent the outbreak of war. He also frequently authorized the CIA to undertake covert actions. The CIA helped topple the governments of Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, but it suffered an embarrassing failure in 1958 when it intervened in Indonesia. It used U.S. power and prestige to help create a non-communist government in South Vietnam, an action that has disastrous long-term consequences. During his last years in office, Eisenhower also waged peace, hoping to improve U.S.-Soviet relations and negotiate a treaty banning nuclear testing in the air and seas. But the Soviet downing of U.S. spy plane ended any hope for a treaty before Eisenhower left office. Before President Eisenhower left office in January of 1961, he urged the necessity of maintaining an adequate military strength, but cautioned the vast, long-continued military expenditures could bring potential dangers to our way of life.
Professor Johnston, how did Eisenhower's military experience translate into his job running the executive branch of the government? Ever since the 1930s, the chief executive has expanded the size of the executive branch of government. President Eisenhower was no exception to this trend. He created the chief of staff position as well as a national security advisor. Eisenhower relied more heavily on his cabinet than any other modern president. In fact, it has been said by many that Eisenhower's cabinet had the least amount of discord of any modern cabinet, allowing them to function without much distraction. Because of the strength of this cabinet and the lack of squabbling among his cabinet members, the President was able to employ a circular model of organization and hold weekly cabinet meetings. Eisenhower also made a crucial number of appointments during his time as President, most importantly, Earl Warren as the Supreme Court Justice. You may know Justice Warren as the Chief Justice for much of the Civil Rights era. Eisenhower was such a popular president that he never had much trouble getting the people who he wanted appointed, mitigating one of the legislative checks on his power as chief executive. Perhaps the most infamous example from Eisenhower's reign as chief executive was his use of executive power in the case of the Little Rock Nine. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, wanted to prevent 9 African American students from attending a segregated school in Arkansas, going against the ruling of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. It would normally fall to Congress to protect these students, but a large faction of Congress was made up of Southern conservative Democrats, who would resist providing federal intervention. However, Eisenhower saw Faubus' actions as both an affront to his personal sensibilities and the power of the federal government. So he signed an executive order sending the 101st Airborne Division of the Army to Little Rock and federalizing the Arkansas militia to prevent Governor Faubus from intervening. This display of strength showed the power that a chief executive can wield. Eisenhower used that power perhaps better than any other modern president, presiding over the only recent united cabinet, making crucial appointments, and using his executive power to protect those citizens who were not being protected by Congress.
Okay, as a panel of well-published experts, I think it's important we discuss the implications of Eisenhower's presidency on whether it increased or decreased the power, and whether it was such a calm time in American history, whether that translated to a cessation of the extended powers of the presidency, or whether he did extend the power of the presidency with his foreign policy actions, with his actions on desegregation.
Right. Well, I definitely think he had to have extended the powers of the presidency. He definitely expanded the executive branch when he added National Security Advisor position as well as the Chief of Staff position. And, he was in total control of the country the entire time he was president. And he had actions such as when he ordered the Army to escort the Little Rock Nine into the desegregated school and took control of the Arkansas State Militia. And, that was a huge expansion of the power of the presidency and a big deal at the time.
True. I mean, he did veto 128 bills. That's a lot of bills.
I mean, to top it all off, he was in complete control of the military, and he was always active in foreign policy issues such as the Cold War and what was going on in Korea. So I strongly believe he was an imperial president.
I agree. To Eisenhower.
To Eisenhower.